Good morning, everybody. Happy Hump Day, and welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's political editor, Pippa Crerar, in one of her final outings for us before she goes off and joins those dreadful hippies at The Guardian. Morning, Pippa.
Good morning, Susie. Great to be here.
I hope you've got your tie-dye uniform ready. This is the People's Paper Review, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast, you're just going to have to holler at the walls instead. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on a horrifying investigation by our colleague Nada Farood about British plastic recycling being dumped and burned in Turkey. It's really shocking, especially if you're one of those who makes an effort to separate the right stuff to recycle and otherwise, and it's really worth buying the paper to read that one in full. But because we have Pippa here today, we're going to look at one of the biggest stories of the day, which is pages 8 and 9 today in the paper, in the Tory leadership race, which is really the least democratic prime ministerial race since the last two of these that we had not long ago. And Pippa, it seems that from your story today there, that the Tory MPs are falling in behind Rishi Sunak, but Tory members want just about anyone except Rishi. So what's going on?
So it's early days in the contest, Susie. So all of this we need to really wait and see. The first vote for Tory MPs to decide their leader is this afternoon. And yesterday they whittled down the field to, I say just 8, but to 8 candidates who are standing. But all the polling and all the sort of the mood music at Westminster suggests that Rishi Sunak is ahead amongst Tory MPs currently. Obviously, the field is still pretty wide. There's 8 Tories standing for the top job. They'd obviously not just become the Tory leader. They take over as Boris Johnson as Prime Minister in September. So it's a pretty broad field. And inevitably, as it goes on, people will get knocked out and their votes will then move to other candidates. But at this stage, Rishi Sunak has got about 40 plus declared supporters from Tory MPs, while the others are sort of in the low 30s. So he very much looks like the establishment candidate to beat. And then I think we're expecting a candidate on the right of the party. That's a much tougher fight, a much more bitter fight, to make it through with him to the final round. I should quickly say that once MPs whittle it down to 2 candidates, it then goes to the members, Tory party members, about 200,000 of them across the country, and they have a series of hustings over the summer, debates, which the pair of them will go to. And then at the very end of the summer, all Tories, MPs, members, will have one member, one vote to decide who's our next Prime Minister.
Yeah, one white man over 50, one vote, who lives in the south of England, to decide who the next Prime Minister is. Now, take me through one thing, Pippa, and because I don't understand this quite, and I'm sure some of our viewers don't either. When you say the right candidates or the left or the centrist candidates, when you're looking at the Tories, we all tend to think that they're just right-wingers. And we know that some are better or different to others. But who are we talking about as being on the right of the party? Because I can see, Suella Braverman, who is 87-1 at the moment, down the bottom there. She's on the right. Kemi Badenoch on the far, not on the far right of the bottom there. She's on the right of the party. But the rest, who's left out of these? Who's right? Who's centrist? What are we actually? Who's Rishi's opponent from the right going to be? Because Liz Truss seems to be both, and all things.
Yeah. So it is a bit confusing, and obviously the Conservative Party is on the right of the political spectrum, but within the Conservative Party, there's sort of there's a right and I'm not sure I'd quite call it a left, but certainly a centre. So there's generally 2 wings of it. And as you rightly identify, Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman are very much on the right of the party, both in terms of their hardline Brexit stance. They want to rip up the Northern Ireland Protocol. They want to withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights. And also in terms of their, what I would describe as culture warrior status. They bang on about things like, trans rights and and
toilets,
statues, and a whole load of issues, because they think it basically, they benefit from having a fight over it, they think, with the left being Labour in this occasion. So they're very much of the right of the party. It's quite interesting because Rishi Sunak is a sort of self-declared Thatcherite, and yet we're regarding him as sort of on the centre stroke left of the Tory party. But it just, I think, is a real indication of how the whole party has shifted further rightwards over recent years, with Brexit absorbing lots of the support that was formerly in UKIP, and with the sort of populist approach that Boris Johnson took. So Rishi Sunak's rivals, or the MPs, the candidates to occupying the same terrain as him, is Tom Tugendhat, who probably is the furthest left of the Tories. He voted for Remain. He's socially liberal. He's pretty pragmatic. He's regarded as being, sort of pretty straight kind of guy. He's a former army officer. He's actually, I think, viewed as a great hope of the future and has garnered quite a lot of support, but I think is unlikely to beat Sunak to that particular slot in this battle. Nadhim Zahawi's the new Chancellor, is sort of flirting with both wings, and I think probably it won't make it further, certainly won't make it to the final two. Probably a lot of his support will split between Rishi Sunak and the candidate on the right. And then the really interesting part of this fight is the battle that's going to go on between Liz Truss and Penny Mordaunt. Liz Truss is Foreign Secretary. Penny Mordaunt is an international trade minister, is much less high profile. People don't really know much about her and what she stands for. She's kind of untested, but she's become a darling of the Tory members in the way that Liz Truss was this time a year ago. Liz Truss has kind of adopted the support of Team Boris, and Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg have sort of like earmarked her as the Stop Rishi Sunak candidate. They think that he's betrayed Boris Johnson by quitting and effectively forcing him out of office. So the battle will be between Penny Mordaunt and Liz Truss for who gets the second slot to take on Rishi Sunak and go to Tory members across the country. And that's where it gets really interesting, because even though the MPs seem to prefer Rishi Sunak so far, the Tory members are much more likely, being to the right of the party again, to go for either Liz Truss or Penny Mordaunt, or whoever the candidate to the right that makes it through on. So there's a big disconnect between the party and the membership.
Ask us your questions, everybody. What do you think about who's going to be the next Tory leader? Who would you prefer? Do you think Rishi Sunak or Tom Tugendhat are raging lefties? Who would you like to see in the final two, for there being a choice between? We do have Conservative voters who watch this show as well, so let us know what you think. Are you a member? Are you one of those lucky people who actually get a vote in this? Who would you like to vote for? Get in the comments and let us know. So it looks like, as you were saying there, Pippa, that these two of the women candidates, Liz Truss and Penny Mordaunt, could easily beat Sunak in it if there was a head-to-head battle with the Tory membership. But there are suggestions that what Rishi's team is doing is making sure he doesn't have to face the people that are most likely to beat him. So, in fact, that great political strategist of our times, Nadine Dorries, for it was she, says that ex-whip Gavin Williamson, who's helping to run Rishi's campaign, is arranging... wait for everybody, is arranging for Rishi's supporters to lend their vote to a no-hoper like Jeremy Hunt, who's on 80 to 1, so that he gets into the final two, and then up against Rishi will walk it. Now, Pippa, is that realistic? Are they capable of being that Machiavellian and yet at the same time so completely bleeding obvious?
I think if you look at previous races, the answer to that is a resounding yes. This sort of game playing and switching of votes definitely happens. It's always happened. And when you see Gavin Williamson's fingerprints on anything, I think you can pretty much guarantee that Machiavellian tactics are at play. I think in this particular instance, we were hearing yesterday from various different sources backing various different campaigns that Jeremy Hunt was struggling to get the 20 votes required to get on the ballot in the first place. And I was told that Rishi Sunak, by a source that I completely trust, that doesn't really have skin in this particular game, that Rishi Sunak had, or something that Gavin Williamson, I don't know whether it was Sunak's permission or not, but that Gavin Williamson had offered those votes to the Hunt campaign in order to get him over the line in the first instance. Now, I have to say, Hunt's campaign denies that vehemently and says that he has a huge amount of support himself and would get over the line. But what's going to be interesting to see that when MPs vote this afternoon, whether that's support for Jeremy Hunt, because you then need to get more than 30 votes to get through to the next stage, whether that support for Hunt stands up. And of course, this isn't the first time we've heard this. Several months ago, before Boris Johnson was even on his way out, there were suggestions of some sort of stitch up being planned. I think it was reported in the Sunday Mirror, in fact, our own Nigel Nelson, between Camp Hunt and Camp Rishi in order for a future leadership contest to do exactly what some say is now happening.
And what would Jeremy Hunt's payoff be for that?
Presumably he'd get a great big fat job in Rishi Sunak's government, whether it be, I mean, the one big job, of course, he's been a health secretary, he's been foreign secretary, which is one of the big jobs. Clearly wouldn't get prime minister if Rishi was in number 10, but you can imagine him being quite keen to have a shot at being Chancellor of the Exchequer. So you suspect there's some sort of deal afoot there. I'm not convinced it's going to work, I have to say. I think that while Rishi Sunak has a huge amount of support, I think managing to stitch up the contest, albeit that the right of the contest is very crowded, managing to stitch up the contest in quite this way when Hunt doesn't seem to have the momentum and support of his own, I think it's unlikely to result in the sort of outcome that we're being told by the Tories, that the sort of outcome that they actually are after.
Yeah, and sometimes in these things, MPs vote for someone they don't necessarily support, but they think should be part of the debate. So I remember when in 2015, the Labour leadership, a debate that got Corbyn into power, Margaret Beckett supported him for the leadership, not because she actually wanted him to be leader, but because she thought that wing of the party deserved to be heard in the debate rather than it be too centrist. And there may be some Tory MPs who are thinking similarly, that the right wing of the party needs to have, seeing if the centrists are, really looking like they've got the most of the ground, that the right wing is going to need some support just to bring it through because they want to keep on doing something or other that the right wing of the party are doing. Who knows? But very interesting if Jeremy Hunt is trying to go for Chancellor. We could all start calling him Chunt instead, which would, I'm sure, would relieve him a lot from what he often gets called by broadcasters. Now, keep asking your questions, everybody. What do you think is going to happen in the Tory leadership race? Are we going to end up with someone who's continuity Boris, as Liz Truss suggests she is, or are we going to end up with someone completely different? Who knows? Now, Mike says, Nadeem Zahari said he would offer Boris Johnson a post in his government if elected. Is this likely to help his chances? Pippa, is Boris even going to stay in Parliament? I mean, you're in Parliament. Surely he wants to get as far away from you as possible.
I think that Boris Johnson would not feel very comfortable being on the back benches. He, of course, had that period between when he quits government, Theresa May's government, and as Foreign Secretary, and launched his own leadership bid, a period of a year or so where he looked thoroughly miserable sat on the back benches, but then he was plotting for the top job. I don't think necessarily he feels that his time in government time leading government is over for good. I think if you cast your minds to Winston Churchill, of course, is Boris Johnson's great hero, he left Parliament and then came back again and did another stint in which he was also Prime Minister. And you can imagine Boris Johnson thinking, well, you know what, if I stand down now, I go away for a few years, do the private universities circuit and the big bank circuit in the States and across Europe, Asia, make a fortune from speeches and writing books, and then come back, because he's not an old man, he's in his mid-50s, then come back in a few years' time and the party will have decided that actually I was a great thing after all, and they'll give me another go. I think that's much more likely than seeing Boris Johnson sit on the back benches for the next 10 years. And whether he ends up back in government, and whether that's a sort of a plus for Nadeem Zahawi, I mean, clearly to me, that is sort of a message to members who are much more supportive of Boris Johnson than the MPs were, that he could be a continuity Boris candidate. I'm not convinced it would go down that well amongst the MPs voting right now. There is a rump of Boris Johnson supporters, but we're talking dozens now. I mean, his support hemorrhaged across the party last week. That much was clear. And I think the people that have supported him still have switched wholesale or almost wholesale to Liz Truss, and Nadeem Zahawi will struggle to pick up any of that support.
Yeah, the idea of Boris coming back to government, he's not Winston Churchill. That's the fundamental argument there against what you've just suggested, is that Winston Churchill was Winston Churchill. Boris Johnson is Boris Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
It may think that there's something similar, but whether they're going to be able to do the same, who knows? Especially as he's done so much to damage their chances. I think reality may hit them at some point. But anyway, yesterday we had this situation in Parliament where the Labour Party tried to call a vote of no confidence in the government, which you could argue with a caretaker prime minister and no clear successor is a pretty reasonable deduction to have arrived at. It would have led to a general election if Labour, the government, had lost that vote. But Boris Johnson refused to allow any time in Parliament to have that debate and vote, which killed the move stone dead. So, Pippa, is that because he thought he was going to lose the vote? And in any event, how could the Tories have possibly had a general election if they haven't got a new leader yet? He would just have had to whip everybody to support the government, wouldn't he? And that would have looked stupid.
So this was a bid by Labour, which in my mind was quite a political one, table a vote of no confidence, not just in the government, which we've had before, but the government and the Prime Minister, and make the Tory MPs decide whether they would walk through the lobbies to prop up that Prime Minister, still in office for another 2 months, despite the fact he's apparently resigned, and the contest is going on to replace him, or whether they abstained. And for me, it was a political manoeuvre by Labour that designed to be able to put on election certificates, election leaflets, your MP back Boris Johnson, stay in office even once his party had got rid of him. It was one of these political stunts we see all the time. It probably wouldn't have got that much attention until the government decided to block it. They claim that because Boris Johnson has resigned, it is no longer a valid motion to have, even though the clerks of the House of the Commons signed it off. And of course, technically, Boris Johnson hasn't yet resigned. He's not gone to the palace and told the Queen that he's off. That won't happen until the beginning of September. So there's been this big debate about, who's right, who's wrong. It's had lots of attention, and Labour are now using it as a stick to hammer Boris Johnson with, and the Tories with, saying, same old. They want to block democracy. They're obstructing MPs having a say, and they're keeping him in office. And actually, it's ended up being quite a successful political attack by Labour, when if the government had just ignored it, they'd have won the vote anyway, and nobody much would have paid any attention.
Wow. It all gets curiouser and curiouser, doesn't it? Now, keep asking your questions, everybody. What do you think about the Tory leadership race? What do you think about how Labour's handling it? Do you think there should be a general election now, or do you want one to wait for one until there's a new Tory leader? And if so, which Tory leader, prospective Tory leader, do you think Keir Starmer wants to face the most? I think he could probably take any of them, but I'm being optimistic, aren't I? Dreadful optimist, that's what everyone says. But in the meantime, we do have some other stories to discuss. So, moving on to other stories about Tories being Tories. Yesterday, the Tory Lords voted down a bid to give free school meals to 1.3 million extra children. Now, this was an amendment to the schools bill, which was going to give the right to one meal a day, one meal a day for about 8 months of the year to every kid whose parents are on universal credit. But it got knocked out of court, Pippa. What happened? Why did they do this?
Well, this is not the first time that there's been an attempt to extend free school meals to all children on universal credit. I mean, currently the issue is that the status is that if children in year 3 and above, that households are eligible if they're on income-related benefits like UC, if their annual household income doesn't exceed £7,400 after tax. Now, there are plenty of people who earn marginally more than that, who are still struggling, still on the breadline, and finding it really difficult to give their children, even one hot meal a day, and who absolutely, in my mind, would be, rightful recipients of this sort of support. The government has resisted it, despite the fact that similar moves have been done across other parts of the UK, resisted it for England. And it's not the first time. You'll remember, I'm sure, that the former Children's Commissioner, Anne Longfield, called for this. And then more recently, we had Henry Dimbleby, the government's food czar, when he reported back on the government's food strategy. He also recommended that this move should be made to take in more children for free school meals, and the government rejected it. And what they said at the time, they didn't outright rule it out on cost grounds. What they said at the time is that they would be using other measures to support families, and they sort of cited their cost of living, energy payments, and things like that. But as we all know, if you're struggling to pay your bills, and you get some money off your, they get a rebate on your council tax, or you get some energy support from the government this October, that money will go on paying your bills. It won't necessarily go directly to food. It doesn't necessarily mean that people will still, won't still be struggling. So I think this will continue. This sort of it's continued to be a big issue. We haven't yet seen Marcus Rashford row in. Obviously, he has previously when it comes to free school meals, and the government has had to U-turn because public support is so clearly on the side of extending it to needy children. So, I think they just end up looking cruel, frankly, if they resist it. And, they'll reach a point where either they'll have to, recognise that if we as a wealthy country, despite the more general economic woes, we are a wealthy country. And if we can't prioritise feeding our children, then what sort of country are we?
Yeah, it is only one meal a day for some of the year. It's not constantly feeding all children permanently. It's a bit of the time. Maybe Marcus is waiting to find out who the new Prime Minister is. And then he'll be on the phone. Let's hope so. And anyway, that bill does come back to the Commons, doesn't it, for another reading? And there's more arguing about it, which is going to be happening. So, right, thank you for taking us through all that, Pippa. But there is some good news in the world, despite all this, right? And it's got nothing to do with the Conservative Party or who's running the country or not running the country. And we've managed to find it for you. And here it is. Now, anybody with any sense knows that their local pub is basically a castle and the landlord is king of all he surveys. But now there's an electrician called Aaron Sanders, there he is with his dogs, who has beaten 200 applicants to become landlord of the Ship Inn on the 26-acre Peel Island off Cumbria, which comes with the title of King of Peel Island. Bless him. Now, Pippa, he's going to be crowned with a pint of beer poured over his head, and he's going to have the power to bestow knighthoods. Now, do we think, I looked at this, and the first thing I thought was this was a perfect retirement job for, let's say, prime ministers being like world king and dishing out honours to their mates. Do we think we could see Boris there in the future?
I thought exactly the same thing when I saw this, particularly the bit about being able to knight people, because we've been trying to get to the bottom of what the Prime Minister's resignation honours might involve. And there's been suggestions that civil servants asked whether, for example, his father Stanley could be knighted. And rumours that people like Nadine Dorries might end up in the House of Lords. So, that's going to be a big story in a couple of months' time. Maybe the safer option would be for this nice chap who's just been given his kingdom of Peel Island to move aside for the sake of the country and to abdicate and offer the role to one Mr. B. Johnson, who could then, bestow any honours he wanted to anyone.
Yeah, exactly. But he would have to live in an island off Cumbria in the Irish Sea, which is surrounded by radioactive waste on all sides.
I think he'd like a castle. I mean, he seems to like checkers and spending his time there, so maybe his family quite fancy living in a castle.
So this one doesn't have a roof.
Right.
Probably many staff. And I don't know whether you'd really ever get the wallpaper to hang on those walls. It's going to come off, isn't it? We'll have to wait and see. I'm very hopeful that the resignation honours will contain something for you, Pippa, because you've done arguably more for Boris Johnson's reputation than anybody else in the past couple of years. Who knows? Lady Pippa, that would be fantastic. I wonder if the Guardian might not want to employ you after that if you were ennobled. Right, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you everyone for taking part. We'll be back again next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. If you're listening on podcast, please leave us a review. It helps other people find us. Bye-bye. See you next time. Thank you.